Great. All right, 1 second. Redmond said, one last question. If you get sent to hell, is there any chance for forgiveness? Or you can be released? Or is it that you're burning for the rest of your life? Council says, I think that's a one-way door because judgment is at death. All right, so the Catholic teaching on this, that because we were created with an immaterial soul, there's this notion that because that soul is created in the image and likeness of God, that it therefore has intrinsic value, as opposed to mere instrumental value. And therefore, it isn't something that God will just annihilate, as some people propose that he does. He willed that you exist. And he holds a thing in existence that he wills to exist. Although the idea of annihilation has been popularized by people like Cameron on Capturing Christianity, it's held by groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists and whatnot. But the idea is that God doesn't destroy his image in things. Right? He willed that we exist in a very specific manner. Okay? And as such, as the book of Revelation states very, very explicitly, that that forever and ever we will be basically with Satan and his demons. Now, such a notion of eternal consciousness in a state of unpleasantness is not something with which God threatens us with. Rather, like for instance, when Jesus said, if your right hand causes you to sin, he's speaking hyperbole here. Cut it off. It is better to enter the kingdom of heaven maimed than for the whole body to be thrown into hell. And God's concern for us is not to threaten us with hell. It's to offer us the way towards our proper end for which we were created, that our hearts would be restless without him. As such, it would be quite unpleasant for a person to totally miss their whole purpose. To not be able to behold the beatific vision, to not be able to fulfill their eternal destiny in enjoying the reason for its existence. And not only that, there certainly will be regrets and pain of sense. I mean, we're talking post general resurrection here. The thing is the way Jesus put it when he says that there's going to be the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. The goats will depart from him and to go to the place that was prepared for the devil and his angels. So first and foremost, it's a place that was very specific in its original purpose, but it is going to also be, here's the thing, here's another way a person has conceptualized this. is if a person really doesn't want to be with God, he's not going to make them. That's one way of putting it. And if a person died outside of grace, all right, they died in a state of mortal sin. They died in a state of original sin. They didn't have sanctifying grace. They never entered into the new covenant. They didn't strive to enter the narrow gate. You know, they didn't try to use all the grace that God has given to us, all his gifts and everything he purposed and ordained for us. You know, if they didn't want those things now, the idea is that they're not going to want those things then. That the state of the soul at death. All right. I think it was Fulton Sheen who says that at the general resurrection, when these souls that have that carnal mind or have this animosity towards God and the things of God, right, it's bent away from God. When it is united then with the body, the nature of the person themselves will fall into hell as easily as a rock falls to the ground when released by the hand. It is the nature of the person at that point. Which is unfortunate, right? Now, there have been proposals that have been rejected. For example, Origen in the 3rd century had proposed, I forget the official term for it, but he had proposed the idea that hell itself was even temporary and that eventually everybody would be saved, even Satan and the fallen angels and everything, and that eventually everything will, it's the every knee shall bow kind of idea. It's the everything will be made subject to him. It's God. And that everything at some point will all come back in line. Unfortunately, that's not the way in which that was rejected in its day. And in fact, let me get. All right, it comes from Origen's work, First Principles. And trying to find the official Origin. Here's the term. The term is apocatastasis. Right, apocatastasis. APO. I'll post it in the chat. Now, I don't hold to this view. This was actually rejected. Okay. Apocatastasis. It comes from the Greek word apocatastasis, which means reconstitution or restitution. It's the idea that ultimately everything will be saved, including the devil and everyone and everything else, right? Because it talks about the restoration of all things in Scripture, and so though this is really supposed to talk about like the Day of Judgment and the resurrection and all that stuff, but will everything be brought back in line or whatnot? That's been rejected by the church. Now so for someone to say that this is exactly what will happen, all right, this apokatastasis is rejected by the church. Yeah. There is, and I only mention it not because I maintain it myself, but because it has been popularized by Bishop Barron out in California. I say popularized, but it has some origin in pun there, in Balthazar. No, was it Balthazar? Second, I want to make sure I get this right. So Hans Urs von Balthasar. He proposed this hopeful universalism. Hopeful universalism. He's saying that you can't know that all will be saved. You can't think that all can be saved. You can't believe that all can be saved. But you can reasonably hope that it's possible. Now, I would argue, how could you reasonably hope for something that you can't think, believe, or teach? You can't believe it, you can't think it, but you can hope it? I think it's kind of a skewed concept of hope. It's a hope that's divorced from belief, a hope that's divorced from... But I kind of get the idea that's behind it. For instance, when I was 10 years old, my father committed suicide. This is very unfortunate. Which puts me in a very unique kind of position. Now, I have prayed for him as I pray for all of my deceased relatives, but I don't know what his fate will be. From what I know of him, and given the fact that his final act of the will was grave matter, very grave, there's also possibilities that people who take their lives because of mental illness and other things, they're not thinking straight, there's stuff that's going on in their head, they're not processing this right, they didn't have full use of their will. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can lessen the severity of something. But the thing is I'm willing to pray for him in case there's stuff I don't know. And I always lead with, Lord, I'm glad I'm not you, because I wouldn't want to be the final determiner of this or that. Another way to look at this and we're touching upon the idea of, you know, the extra ecclesiam nulla salus, the teaching of the Catholic Church, that outside the Catholic Church there is no salvation, conception. It's been understood that God's grace works in ways that extend beyond structures and sacraments and things like that. And there's a great deal of people who are baptized and they're actually responding to God's grace. They want to know God. And there's people who may not even have been baptized yet, or who have some vague sense of following certain glimmers of light and receptive to some degree as God is leading them, and they're allowing themselves to be led. And the thing is, you don't really know who those people are. You just don't. So you have to always just assume that, or I should say, you know, we can hope that there's more of those people out there than there are people who are just not good-natured at all. And it's without a radical change of heart, it's really difficult to see what could possibly come of this person or that person. And the thing is it's not so much, hey, I want to be in heaven, I want to be with God, I want to be with my family members, but God's just not going to let me, kind of thing. And it's I doubt that there's going to be anybody who go there that have that kind of attitude in mind. Some people, I think, probably struggle with things, maybe because their conscience wasn't properly formed, or they've had bad things happen to them. They've had, you know, bad company corrupts good character. They didn't have a very good upbringing. And God sees all this stuff. He knows all this stuff, and He knows what you're going through, and He knows what you are and you're not responsible for. And so when I think of these people who are like actively involved in like divination, and they want to be possessed by demons, and you know, they're sacrificing goats to Satan, and now obviously, you know, obviously there's that kind of explicit. These people really want nothing to do with God at all, and that they would rather just toy with demons and things taught by demons and stuff. But I think there's a difference between a person who dabbles because they don't know any better and they're curious, and someone who is just, they've taken a diabolical position against God. You know, I think there's a difference between the atheist who says there is no God, you know, this God you're talking about is hideous, he's gross, he's evil, he's this, that, and I'll never serve, I'll never bow. which is diabolical. But that's altogether different than a person who, as far as their rational capacity is concerned, they're still working on the question, but they're not closed off to it. Maybe they might be more agnostic, but have some atheistic leanings. You know, the same kind of diabolical nature of the first example isn't as explicit and as so which brings me back to, I'm glad I'm not the one who has to make those decisions. But so Catholic teaching is, yes, there's going to be eternal consciousness. There is going to be a heaven and a hell. There will be no chance to get out of hell. Your chance to get out of hell is right now, for instance. I don't know who conceptualized it, but there was this idea that, you know, both of those who are in hell and in heaven are both experiencing God's holiness. Those who have been purified by the fire of God's love in preparation for the beatific vision. We could talk about purgatory. All right. But the same fire of God's love is experienced differently. For those who don't want it, I can maybe liken it this way. You give a child a hug, and they really take it in. Versus you try to give a child a hug, and they just squirm, and they just don't want to be touched, and what have you. The nature of the former will be how people who are prepared for heaven are responding to God's holy love. That purifying, burning fire of God's holy love has just so formed who and what you are, it's pleasant to you to be in His presence. Whereas those in the latter example, they're repulsed by the very same thing. They're repulsed by it. They're resistant to it, so it's a kind of a torment to them. It's difficult for me to think in terms of a pain of loss without some sort of conception of it could have been better. So I try not to project upon one who is in such a state as if, hey, there's this good-natured person who tried to live their life the best they could. They just didn't work out all the ideas in their head in time, and they weren't as responsive to God's grace or knew that it was working in them on implicit levels, and they're just surprised to be among the goats, and then their eternity is nothing but them just, I didn't want to be here. I wanted to be with God. You know, this is cruel. That's not really how one should conceptualize that. It's they don't want to be with God. They prefer to be where they're at. It's the I would rather rule in hell than to serve in heaven. But in all the things that I had described and explained, one thing is for sure. We were made for God. And we will only truly be happy in holiness. We will only truly be ultimately happy when the end for which we were created finds its fulfillment in the one from whom we came. And for those who don't want that, that is what the Catholic Church refers to as hell. Alright. So hopefully that answers your question, Remy. I know I'm long-winded. I get it. One interesting book to read by C.S. Lewis is The Great Divorce, where he conceptualized those who are heaven-bound become larger and more solid, whereas those who drift away from God become smaller and more transparent. And he uses this allegory to show this. I thought it was really interesting. I read it in college. The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. And of course, he's referring to the divorce that takes place in humanity, the sheep and the goats. Right? All right, so